A Turkish company says that it is in talks to send floating power ships to help supply electricity to Ukraine. Russia has stepped up attacks on Ukraine's power grid. About half of the power grid is now offline. Ukraine says that's putting millions of people at risk of getting sick and even death during the cold winter months.
Now is the winter of blackouts in Ukraine. Like here in the city of Lviv, nights without power have become part of wartime life for millions. Russia has been relentless in its attacks on Ukraine's power plants, substations and distribution lines. About half of the country's energy system has been crippled, officials say. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accuses Moscow of energy terrorism.
The very fact that Russia resorted to terror against the energy industry shows the weakness of the enemy. They cannot defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, and that is why they are trying to break our people in this way.
Countries around the world have pledged immediate aid to help rebuild Ukraine's energy grid, supplying generators, transformers and other hardware. One possible solution to the country's energy emergency could come from Turkey, and it involves ships like these. They call them power ships, floating electricity generation plants. The Turkey-based company Car Powership has a fleet of 36. They are at energy crisis spots around the world. The ships use either fuel oil or natural gas to generate electricity and feed it into local power grids. Some have an output of several hundred megawatts per hour.
This ship over here can generate about 420 megawatts of power, enough for 4 million people, so it could supply the residents of a city like Berlin.
The ships have been used in shortage-stricken countries like Lebanon, Senegal and Indonesia. Zeynep Harezi, one of the company's senior executives, says she is in talks to send several power ships to help alleviate the Ukraine energy crisis.
We are in discussions with Ukrenergo, with Odessa Governorate, with Moldova utilities, with Romania utilities, to understand the best way to send electricity to Ukraine. We can actually deploy these ships in less than 30 days and make them operational to inject new kilowatt hours, new electricity on the grid, which is what is needed for Ukraine.
The initial idea was to send the power ships to Odessa, Ukraine's largest port, Harezi says. But security and hence insurance are major considerations. The ships may be deployed to neighboring countries instead.
We need to ensure the safety and security of our personnel, of our ships, and if this is not possible while operating within Ukrainian borders, it may be possible while operating at Gürgüleşti port in Moldova or Constanța port in Romania and transmitting the electricity to Ukraine via transmission lines.
Costs and financing also remain key issues. So far, there is no deal. Ukraine's energy ministry wasn't available for a comment, so it's not clear if or when the first power ships might make their way to help Ukraine get some lights back on during a brutal winter of blackouts.
Well, for more on the challenges facing Ukraine, I'm joined now by James Hudson. He is the CEO of AI for Good Foundation. He's also a co-founder of Economists for Ukraine. He joins us from Berkeley, California. It's good to have you on the show, James. The UN says that half of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed by Russian attacks. You wrote in a recent LA op-ed piece that you blame part of this condition, the miserable condition, on Western technology. Explain that. Why is that so?
Well, thank you for inviting me back to the show. And last time when we were discussing, we also talked about infrastructure damage. It was right at the beginning of the infrastructure strikes when roughly half of the infrastructure had been hit in a space of 2 weeks. And we talked then about the resiliency of Ukraine's energy system. Now, yes, I think that there is a part of the damage that has occurred to Ukraine's infrastructure that can be pinned on the provision of Western technology to Russia, which is a continuing process since the beginning of the war and since obviously long before then. Let me put it a little bit into context, though, because it sounds a little bit stark when put like that. In November, we released a recommendation paper for technology sanctions against the Russian Federation, which had three parts. One was to remove military enabling technology that the West continues to provide. The second was about cyber warfare technology, and the third was about information space technology. Now, it is extremely important, right, in order to prevent Russia from continuing the war in general, that we remove the technology capabilities that Western companies underpin within Russia. And that's something that continues to be the case. However, the thing that's breaking Ukraine's energy grid is Russian missiles, right, and attacks by Russia, and continuing attacks within civilian spaces, which also prevent the reconstruction of those grids and the potential strengthening and resilience of those grids going forward. So it's not just about Western technology. It's mostly about Russia continuing their military attacks, which are very traditional military attacks at this point.
And James, moving forward then, talk to me about the role of Western technology in rebuilding the infrastructure during the war, but also when the war is over.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk generally about the merging of Western and Ukrainian technology when we're talking about rebuilding both the kind of power infrastructure, the general kind of civil society infrastructure, and putting Ukraine on a strong footing going forward. We have to remember that Ukraine's tech sector is extremely strong, extremely resilient, in fact, and very innovative as well. What Ukraine has been able to do with Western-supplied weapons, with also societal infrastructure, so sub-panels and other grid technology, in order to quickly decentralize and increase the resiliency of society and kind of the critical infrastructure that relies on, has been astounding. And, I've been working in the technology and AI sector for 2 decades at this point, and it's incredible to see what Ukraine has been able to do over such a short span of time. We need to continue supporting Ukraine with as much of that technology. We need to help decentralize these different grids and kind of technology components that help society to run. We need to make sure that everybody has internet during extended blackouts, which is one of the big projects that we're working on right now with Cisco and Microsoft and other kind of big players in this area, because ultimately it comes down to protecting the grid, allowing people to continue living normal lives to the extent possible, and keeping the economy running. Right. And that's where Western technology can have a big impact.
Big investments in the future for sure. James Hudson joining us tonight from Berkeley, California. James, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
So let's talk more about those challenges facing Ukraine. I'm very pleased to welcome Tatiana Durigina, an associate professor of finance at the University of Illinois. She's also part of the global collective Economists for Ukraine. Tatiana, the UN says half of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed in Russian attacks. When everything is in ruins, where do you even start rebuilding?
That is a great question. I do think that energy is fundamental to the way that modern economies operate. It's just necessary for getting anything else done. And I think you absolutely have to start rebuilding with energy infrastructure.
Now, a recent estimate by the World Bank put the total cost of rebuilding Ukraine to be up to 600 billion euros. That is a lot of money. Who do you think should pay for it?
Well, I think the obvious answer is Russia. Russia has caused the damage in Ukraine, and it obviously has the necessary funds to pay for it. So ultimately, it should be Russia who pays.
But what would that actually look like in practical terms? Is there any mechanism by which you could have Russia pay?
So I'm not a legal expert, but I know that many legal experts are working currently on setting up a system by which seized Russian assets or frozen Russian assets can be used as reparations for Ukraine. I think obviously we need a very transparent framework to make sure everything is done legally, but I believe that it should be possible. And if it's not, then I do think European donors need to step up, because this is a matter of life and death, and at least temporarily provide the funds that Ukraine needs before Russia is made to pay.
Well, regardless of who does end up paying, whenever you're looking at that much money on the table, there's also the risk of corruption. And that's a problem we've seen even in recent days that Ukraine is no stranger to. How do you go about making sure that financing to rebuild does go into the right places and not just into somebody's pockets?
Yeah, I think you need a lot of transparency. You need a lot of oversight. For example, if you have you should have competitive contracts for who is going to do the rebuilding, and the details of these contracts and all the bids should be made public, so that it is easier to ensure that the money goes where it needs to go.
Mm-hmm. Now, rebuilding, some would say, is the silver lining is it's also a chance to reimagine. Do you think there are opportunities for Ukraine as it rebuilds?
Absolutely. I think, Ukraine, for example, had a lot of very outdated, very energy inefficient housing stock. And so whatever housing needs to be replaced should be built to highest energy efficiency standards. Industrial processes were also outdated. So there's a lot of modernization that can happen at the same time that will help make Ukraine a stronger economy.
Thank you so much for that. That is Tatiana Durigina, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Illinois. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me.